Welcome back to Cold Blood Files, where we explore true crime stories, chilling cases, and the mysteries hidden behind the curtain of justice. If you're into this kind of content, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss the next shocking case. Today, I want to take you into a case that many may have forgotten, but it remains a painful reminder of the justice system's failure in the face of a sick predator. A man who seemed ordinary, nothing like the Hollywood serial killers. But he was a demon, sneaking into children's dormitories, across nations, for years, and no one saw him. In the summer of 1996, what was supposed to be an innocent school trip for a group of British students turned into a haunting memory. That morning, a 13-year-old girl, Caroline Dickinson, was found dead in her bed. No scream. No sign of struggle. No cameras. No witnesses. The only thing left behind? A cold body and an eerie sense of horror. Someone had silently entered in the night, committed a crime, and slipped away like he was never there. And it took 5 years, thousands of DNA samples, and one unexpected moment at a U.S. airport for the mystery to finally unfold. The killer, Francisco Arce Montes, was no one-time offender. He was a ghost who wandered through youth hostels across Europe for nearly 2 decades. A depraved pedophile, a cunning predator disguised as a man. But how did he escape justice for so many years? Why wasn't he stopped before Caroline died? And what's the true cost of silence? Let's uncover the entire case, from Francisco Arce Montes's wandering past, to that fateful night in France, and the manhunt that nearly failed. When we talk about sex offenders, especially pedophiles, there's a tendency to assume they're abnormal, easy to spot, and pushed to the edges of society. But the real danger lies in the fact that not all of them are like that. Some, like Francisco Arce Montes, live hidden within communities, seemingly harmless on the outside, but in reality, hunters waiting for the right moment. For more than 2 decades before being arrested, Montes wasn't just a pedophile. He was the perfect example of a new type of dangerous offender, nomadic, anonymous, and able to exploit the lack of coordination between national justice systems to stay on the run. He never intended to kill at first. But because the system failed to stop his early offenses, a 13-year-old girl had to pay the price. The 1990s were a time of massive change in Europe, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the expansion of the European Union, and agreements like Schengen that allowed citizens to move freely between countries without visas or strict passport checks. For most people, it was a sign of freedom and progress. But for someone like Montes, it was the perfect travel pass to disappear into the crowd. Montes had been investigated or arrested for suspicious sexual behavior in Spain, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and even the United States. But for nearly 20 years, no country held on to his records long enough, and none of them warned the others when he crossed borders. The absence of a working international crime data sharing system basically handed him a passport to offend freely. This raises a major question: how advanced can a society claim to be, if it still leaves deadly loopholes in its security? Francisco Arce Montes wasn't the kind of criminal who acted out of anger or temporary loss of control. He had methods, he carefully chose his targets, and most importantly, he learned from each crime. He sought out places filled with minors, especially girls, in vulnerable environments, summer camps, dormitories, youth hostels, group lodgings. He'd squat there, hide in plain sight, befriend staff, study the access routines, and only then make his move. Multiple documents show that Montes usually didn't plan to kill. His initial objective was always to satisfy his twisted sexual urges with children, but if the victim resisted or if he risked being exposed, he was willing to do whatever it took to get away. That's why Caroline Dickinson, the unfortunate target during a school trip, never woke up again. What's terrifying about Montes isn't just what he did, but how calmly he did it. He could wait silently for hours, watching the students, learning their sleeping schedules, sneaking in at night without making a sound. This wasn't instinct. This was planning. One major reason predators like Francisco Arce Montes can operate for so long is because communities, especially during the 1980s and 90s, refused to believe something like this could happen. Reports of suspicious sexual behavior were downplayed or treated as minor infractions. Many underage victims were too afraid to speak up, or were told by their parents to stay silent to avoid shame. That culture of silence, combined with fragmented legal systems, created a blind spot that Montes exploited to the fullest. There was even a case where he was caught masturbating inside a children's dormitory in the Netherlands, but because he hadn't physically assaulted anyone, he received only an administrative fine and was deported. Just a few weeks later, he was seen in France, then Germany. Each country recorded the incident as an isolated case. No one realized they were dealing with the same man. Imagine a 13-year-old child going away on her first school trip, excited to explore the world, believing she's safe in a group, with teachers watching over and friends nearby. And yet in one night, all forms of protection became useless, because the attacker didn't crawl out from under the bed or the bushes. He walked through the front door, silently entered, and left with a life. Francisco Arce Montes is living proof that one person can bypass every layer of protection in modern society, if that society refuses to see evil for what it is. Francisco Arce Montes had no permanent residence, no fixed address, no stable job. He lived a vagrant lifestyle, constantly moving from Spain to France, then to the Netherlands, Germany, Italy, Belgium, Switzerland, and even the United States. His way of life resembled that of a lone wolf, unbound, leaving few traces behind. When he ran out of money, he did odd jobs, slept in cheap hostels, public shelters, or even churches. If someone caught him doing something suspicious, he simply vanished, only to reappear in another city, another country, as if nothing had ever happened. From the late 1970s to the early 2000s, Montes was arrested, investigated, or accused at least 6 times in various countries for acts related to minors. But the striking thing is, he was never sentenced to long-term prison. Perhaps due to lack of evidence, or because the behavior didn't meet the threshold for serious charges, but regardless of the reasons, it was the justice systems themselves that sent him on his way to his next victim. In Spain, his birth country, Montes was once arrested for rape. However, for unknown reasons, he was either not sentenced or served little to no jail time. Some documents state he was briefly held in a psychiatric facility but never incarcerated long-term. In the Netherlands, he was caught masturbating inside a dormitory for children. Yet he was merely fined and deported. The question remains, why wasn't any warning sent to authorities in France or Germany about his dangerous behavior toward minors? In France, where the main crime would later occur, Montes briefly lived in Brittany, precisely where Caroline Dickinson was killed. During that time, no one paid attention to his presence. He had no temporary residence record, no work registration. He was just another anonymous tourist among thousands. In the United States, Montes entered the country with a valid passport and lived in Florida. When he was arrested in 2001 for a sexual assault at a hotel, U.S. police had no idea they had just captured a murderer wanted in Europe for the past 5 years. This all points to a harsh reality. If someone like Montes had a bit of patience, avoided violence, and knew how to move at the right time, he could evade the justice system for a lifetime. Unlike many sex offenders who act impulsively or suffer acute mental breakdowns, Montes was calculated. He always chose places where minors gathered, especially summer camps, student hotels, school dormitories. He posed as a tourist, asked to stay over, or rented short-term lodging. At each place, he would quietly observe, searching for an opportunity. Who's sharing a room with whom? Which rooms are locked? Who's sleeping alone? Who seems vulnerable? Like a patient predator, he waited for the perfect time, usually at night, when no one was alert and no adults were keeping watch. This deliberate, hunting style made Montes even more dangerous than spontaneous criminals, because he didn't kill to release rage. He killed to erase evidence. His victims died simply because they had seen his face. During the 1980s and 90s, many European countries treated sexual offenses lightly unless they involved direct rape. Someone like Montes, caught peeping, masturbating in public, or approaching minors, was usually just warned, fined, or deported. He wasn't placed on a watch list, banned from being near schools, or recorded in any cross-border system. At that time, even a shared DNA database didn't exist. If he committed a crime in France and fled to the Netherlands, the police in both countries had no way to share that information efficiently. It wasn't until after 2000, when the European Union began implementing a more unified cross-border sex offender database, that real connections started forming. Sadly, Caroline Dickinson died before that system could save her. Strangely enough, Francisco Arce Montes wasn't particularly smart. He had no university degree, no money, no power. But he had 3 critical assets: patience, isolation, and invisibility, which together made him a legal phantom. He didn't stand out. He didn't cause scenes. He left no bank trails or official paperwork. He lived simply, with only a backpack, a train station, and a tourist map. The only thing he consistently carried was his intent to get close to children. We often picture evil as cinematic villains, but in real life, it looks more like Francisco, quiet, assimilated, unnoticed, unfeared. In the summer of 1996, a group of secondary school students from Cornwall, England, traveled to Western France as part of a language and cultural exchange program. It was an annual trip, a few days long, designed to help students practice French, explore the countryside, and learn about local life. Caroline Dickinson, a cheerful, well-behaved, and helpful 13-year-old girl, was among those selected for the trip. She had no idea it would be the last journey of her life. On July 18, 1996, while the group was staying at a hostel in the village of Plainfougers, the students woke up to start their day. But chaos quickly erupted when a classmate found Caroline unresponsive in her bed, showing no signs of life. The teachers immediately called for emergency services. But it was already too late. When police and paramedics arrived, they classified it as a suspicious death. What was suspicious? There were no signs of struggle. No one had heard any screams. The door hadn't been forced open. Everything had happened in complete silence, to the point where even the girls in the next bed didn't notice anything unusual. A serious crime had just taken place, in what should have been the safest environment, among dozens of students and teachers. French investigators launched a full investigation, but were immediately challenged by the crime scene: no obvious evidence, no clear witnesses, and no obvious suspect. What made them certain this wasn't a natural death or accident were subtle clues: the position of the body and the state of her clothing. Police suspected Caroline had been assaulted while asleep, but when they questioned her roommates, everyone said, "We heard nothing." It seemed impossible. How could a stranger sneak in, commit such a violent act, and leave without waking anyone? Police considered that the attacker might have been someone familiar, or someone who had been stalking the group. But among all the people examined, from local staff to temporary guests, no one had a criminal record or stood out enough to be arrested. Despite the lack of cameras or witnesses, police had one critical piece of evidence: a foreign DNA sample recovered at the scene. It didn't match any of the students or teachers, meaning it belonged to an outsider. This was the first solid lead. For the first time, investigators had something specific to compare. What followed was one of the largest DNA collection campaigns in the region. Over 4,000 people were asked or volunteered to give DNA samples. But the results were all negative. Not one person matched the sample from the crime scene. The case went cold. Caroline's family returned to England, devastated and without answers. British public opinion was furious, not only at the tragic death of a 13-year-old but at the seeming inability of authorities to investigate properly. Then, a small overlooked detail resurfaced. One student from the group reported that a few days before the murder, when they were still at another location, St. Lenaire, she had woken up to find a strange man standing next to her bed. He left immediately when she noticed him. Initially, this incident had been dismissed as a misunderstanding or prank. But now, in light of Caroline's death, it seemed chilling. Had someone been watching the students all along? Did he first test the waters in St. Lenaire before committing the crime in Plainfagers? If so, this wasn't impulsive, it was a calculated plan, targeting a specific victim. The way the crime was committed, silent, discreet, without obvious traces, suggested the attacker had done this before. This wasn't someone acting on a whim, but a person skilled at hiding, avoiding detection, and reading situations. A theory began to form: the killer wasn't a local, but someone constantly on the move, living in society's shadows, possibly homeless, undocumented, or illegally traveling. The truth, as later revealed, was even more terrifying. Caroline's death sent shockwaves through both Britain and France. British media questioned the school's responsibility, the lack of student safety abroad, and the poor security at low-budget hostels. French authorities came under immense pressure from international media. The tragedy wasn't just about one life lost. It exposed massive holes in how schools and governments protected students, especially when traveling overseas. Caroline's family, despite their grief, stayed involved in every step of the investigation. They refused to let their daughter become just another forgotten name in a cold case file. For years following Caroline Dickinson's death, the case file grew thicker, but the leads remained frustratingly empty. More than 4,000 DNA samples had been compared. Hundreds of witnesses were interviewed. Numerous theories were constructed and dismissed. Public confidence in law enforcement began to waver. French citizens worried about the safety of their children. The British press continuously criticized the lack of protection for students abroad. And worst of all, Caroline's family still had no clear answer about who had taken their daughter's life. The investigation seemed destined to fade into oblivion, until an unexpected twist unfolded across the Atlantic Ocean. In 2001, 5 years after Caroline's death, security officers at Miami International Airport, USA, detained a man whose behavior had raised suspicion. At first, it was standard procedure. The man appeared nervous, acted evasively, and presented unclear documents. But when they collected his fingerprints and DNA to verify his identity, a red alert appeared in the International Crime Database. The DNA was a 100% match to the genetic material collected from the scene of Caroline Dickinson's murder in 1996. No one expected that after 5 years of fruitless searching across Europe, the killer would be found, by chance, at an American airport. The detained man's name was Francisco Arce Montes, a Spanish national. He had no fixed address, no stable job, and a documented history of traveling through several countries over the previous decade. Once his identity was confirmed and linked to the case in France, French authorities immediately requested his extradition for prosecution. But U.S. authorities couldn't release him right away. They were also investigating him for other sexual offenses committed on American soil. Both countries quickly understood this wasn't some nameless drifter. They were dealing with an international predator who had operated for years across borders with a disturbingly clear modus operandi. According to his record, Francisco Arce Montes had traveled through Spain, France, Italy, Germany, the Netherlands, and the US. He had no stable employment, no permanent residence. He often stayed in cheap hostels, train stations, temporary dormitories, and more disturbingly, he was frequently found near schools, youth housing, or any place where minors gathered. Unlike most violent criminals, Montes operated with stealth, patience, and extreme discretion. He didn't rob. He didn't destroy. He left no bloody scenes, which made him all the more dangerous. He knew how to pick vulnerable targets, avoid making noise, and escape quickly. That's why, for so many years, he stayed under the radar, until DNA spoke the truth. Despite being held in the US on separate charges, thanks to legal agreements between France and the United States, Francisco was eventually extradited to France in late 2001. What shocked the public even more was his response during questioning. Francisco admitted he had been present at the scene on the night of the murder. But he denied killing Caroline. He claimed he had entered the wrong room, that he had no intention to harm, and that everything was just a misunderstanding. Of course, no one believed him, and the DNA evidence from the scene made his lies useless. What was more telling was his audacity in lying about such a horrific crime, proving that this was not his first offense, it was just the first time he got caught. In June 2004, Francisco Arce Montes was sentenced to 30 years in prison in France, the maximum sentence possible at the time for the charges brought against him. In court, he showed no visible remorse. His cold expression and indifferent demeanor shocked everyone present, and only reinforced the image of a cold-blooded predator wearing a human mask. Caroline's family, through tears, stated, "This isn't absolute justice, but at least we now know who took our daughter away." After Francisco Arce Montes was finally captured and convicted, one critical question echoed, not just from the media, but from lawmakers and ordinary citizens alike. Why did it take 5 years, and a random incident in the US, to identify and arrest him? How could a man with a history of drifting, suspicious behavior, and multiple accusations manage to slip through so many legal systems without being held accountable? The answer is complex, and it exposes deadly weaknesses in how the world handles transnational sex crimes. For more than a decade, Montes wasn't hiding in a forest or living off the grid. He moved openly, at train stations, cheap hotels, youth hostels, from Madrid to Berlin, Paris to Amsterdam. He was even temporarily detained in Germany for behavior involving minors, but released due to insufficient evidence. The problem was simple: each country only knew what happened within its own borders. There was no fast, integrated system for sharing information about individuals involved in sexual misconduct or suspected offenses. When Montes was detained in Germany, German police had no idea he'd been previously accused in Spain. When Spanish authorities recorded his suspicious behavior, they didn't share it with Interpol or neighboring countries. And when Caroline was murdered in France, French police had no idea that Montes had been arrested in Germany the year before. In 1996, when the crime occurred, DNA analysis technology was still slow and relatively new. There were no international databases that could instantly cross-reference DNA samples. Data was stored in scattered locations. There was no mechanism to synchronize everything effectively. Even after French investigators had DNA from the crime scene, they couldn't compare it with millions of potential samples around the world, unless a suspect was directly apprehended and tested. Montes understood this. By constantly changing countries, avoiding long-term stays, and living as a legal ghost, he became the perfect example of a multi-legged criminal that no single country could track alone. What's terrifying is that Montes wasn't on any blacklist or sex offender database for years. He had been accused, detained, and investigated, but never convicted. So when he arrived in a new country, he was a blank slate, no criminal record, no alerts, no red flags. The justice systems of the time relied too heavily on the logic of commit a crime, get convicted, be recorded, instead of implementing risk-based warning systems. This allowed people like Montes to travel undetected through the legal cracks. Officials later admitted, "We were far too slow." Following Caroline's case, French, Spanish, and US authorities held multiple press conferences to acknowledge their failures. A series of reforms were proposed. The creation of a unified DNA and criminal database for the European Union. A shared database for individuals exhibiting sexual misconduct, even if not yet convicted. Special surveillance for people accused multiple times in multiple locations. However, many experts argued these changes came too late. Had such systems existed earlier, Montes might never have been free for so long, and Caroline Dickinson might still be alive today. What's truly concerning isn't just Montes himself, but the criminal model he represents. In a modern world where people can travel easily, with relaxed visa controls, and uneven technology across countries, an offender can start over in a new country within days. Francisco Arce Montes is only one of many predators who learn to exploit the world's fragmented legal structures to do evil, and avoid consequences for years. What made him dangerous wasn't rage or brutality, it was patience, cold calculation, and invisibility. Nearly 6 years after the death of Caroline Dickinson, justice finally stood a chance to be served. Francisco Arce Montes was extradited to France, where he would face trial for the brutal killing of the 13-year-old girl. But what shook the public wasn't just what he had done, it was the way he attempted to defend the indefensible. The Rennes trial, a case that gripped an entire nation. In 2004, Francisco Arce Montes officially stood trial in the city of Rennes, western France. This was not merely a criminal proceeding, it was a symbol of pain, anger, and the profound disappointment of an entire generation of parents. The courtroom was packed. International media were present. Caroline's family sat silently, accompanied by their legal team and representatives from the government. Meanwhile, the accused, Montes, appeared frail, expressionless, and showed no visible sign of remorse. When the prosecutor presented the evidence, including a 100% DNA match, witness statements from the hostel, and Montes's own initial confession in the U.S., the courtroom fell into a tense, almost breathless silence. The unforgivable defense, "I didn't mean to." One of the most infuriating aspects of the trial was the defense strategy employed by the accused. Through his lawyer, Montes claimed that he never intended to kill Caroline. He insisted he merely wanted to watch her, meant no harm, and that her death was an accident. At one point, he even stated, "I feel hurt that people see me as a monster." This statement was immediately slammed by the media as an insult to the intelligence of the victim and the public. Some journalists reported, "He didn't cry. He didn't shake. He didn't apologize." The entire trial felt like a performance mocking justice and the suffering of the victim's family. On the first day of the trial, hundreds of local citizens and child protection organizations stood outside the courthouse holding signs that read, "Justice for Caroline. No mercy for predators." French television channels dedicated hours of coverage to analyzing the trial. A psychologist on national TV, TF1, stated, "No one is born a monster. But when someone chooses to act like one, society has the right to treat them as such." After several emotionally charged days, Francisco Arce Montes was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, the maximum penalty allowed under French law for his crimes. The verdict was met with tearful applause and visible relief. Caroline's father, John Dickinson, made only one short statement. "Today, we are not seeking revenge. We just want our daughter to rest in peace." The Caroline case, and the name Francisco Arce Montes, has since become a staple example used in law schools, child protection conferences, and documentaries on international justice failures. What made this trial so significant wasn't just the sentence, it was the collective awakening. European nations began integrating sex offender information systems. Many countries reformed their child protection laws. Schools and educators began teaching children how to spot red flags and speak up when something feels wrong. The case of Francisco Arce Montes is not only the story of a dangerous predator, but also a harsh warning about the deadly gaps in both our legal systems and social awareness. Caroline Dickinson, a sweet 13-year-old girl, didn't just fall victim to a wandering pedophile, she fell victim to institutional disconnect, bureaucratic indifference, and a long silence that went unchallenged for too long. Looking back, one can't help but shudder at the reality. Montes had been caught before. He had been reported. He had even crossed paths with law enforcement. And yet every time, he slipped away, not because of brilliance or luck, but because of the carelessness and apathy of the systems and people around him. This case raises critical questions. Why wasn't someone with a history of targeting minors under close watch? Why didn't European countries at the time share sex offender data across borders? And why were there so many victims before Caroline, yet no one spoke up in time? No one can bring Caroline back. But her story forced the world to change. International organizations began building shared criminal databases. Interpol strengthened its DNA collaboration programs. And hundreds of child protection campaigns were launched across Europe in the years that followed. That flicker of progress is the only light that shines through this darkness. If there's just one message to take from this case, it is this: silence is not neutrality. In a world where evil can sneak into dorms, classrooms, or playgrounds, indifference can be deadly. Teach children to speak up. Pay attention to the unusual. Always ask questions, because justice is not born of luck, but of the active vigilance of each one of us. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this video. Every view, comment, and share helps ensure stories like this are heard, remembered, and never repeated. If you found this content meaningful, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next true crime case. This is Cold Blood Files, and I'll see you in the next episode.